Road Trips, Chicken Parmesan, and Handcuffs by Adriana in the Snow. Chapter 6. Logan had never been particularly good at falling asleep. His father had always told him it was because he was too smart. He remembered long nights of frustration where his body was exhausted but he couldn't get to sleep. Often he spent this time in the living room, and even though his father never had any issues with sleep himself, he'd always stayed up with Logan. Logan had many fond memories of late-night snacks and warm tea or milk with his father, even though he'd often felt guilty for keeping him awake, since the man had to open the flower shop early in the mornings. Sometimes a full belly and a gentle story from his father had helped him finally get to sleep, and sometimes it didn't, but he'd appreciated it either way. They talked to doctors about the issue, but the bouts of insomnia were inconsistent, and no proposed solution had seemed to help. His father had come to the conclusion that his brain had too many thoughts, and so it took longer than it did for most people for him to shut everything down at night. That seemed to be close enough to the truth for Logan. In his youth, he would often find his brain writing essays on philosophy or imagining science experiments when he should have been calming down to sleep. He'd never been able to help it. Nowadays, his mind would often turn toward obsessing over his goals, though every so often the more frivolous pursuits of his youth still invaded his head and kept him awake. There never were tea and cookies and stories any more, however. Just Logan, in a bed alone, staring at the ceiling. Tonight, he was again unable to go to sleep, though this was not for the usual reasons. This reason was much less about his thoughts, and much more about his emotions. It was 2 a.m. He'd attempted to retire to sleep at 10 p.m., but his efforts were for naught. He found himself quite haunted by his own roving thoughts and feelings every time he closed his eyes. This was why he was awake to hear the footsteps in the hall. A part of him groaned, expecting this to be an escape attempt, though the footsteps were not from the living room, and so were likely Virgil's and not Remus's. Logan honestly didn't expect Virgil to attempt escape, at least not in the middle of the night. And in fact, Logan ended up being proven correct, as the footsteps stopped outside his door instead of continuing toward the front door. There was a long moment of hesitation, and Logan held his breath. Then the door cracked open slightly. "You're awake," Virgil said. The soft words were somewhere between a question and a statement. The way he'd said it seemed to imply he'd been anticipating Logan still being awake. "Yes," Logan confirmed. He wondered what Virgil could see of him from the hallway. It was quite dark in Logan's room. Virgil himself was illuminated by the light in the hallway, but most of his face was still in shadows, hiding Virgil's expression. The door slowly creaked open further, allowing more of the hallway light to spill into Logan's bedroom briefly. Yet then, that light was abruptly cut off as Virgil stepped inside and closed the door behind him. "Did you need something?" Logan asked, watching the dark blob near the door that was Virgil. "I was just wondering if you were awake," Virgil said, sounding as exhausted as Logan currently felt. That, Logan thought, was not at all an adequate explanation as to what Virgil was doing here. Why had he wondered if Logan was awake? Why had that urged him to come to Logan's room? "I am," Logan replied simply. "I thought I could hear you thinking through the walls," Virgil said. Logan could just barely make out the sight of Virgil pushing his hair out of his face. Wondered if my Logan senses still worked. Logan had no response for that, and they were silent for a long moment. "I'm sorry if I offended you earlier tonight." Logan finally broke the silence. "Offended?" Virgil scoffed. Logan did not know why he sounded offended that Logan had said he was offended. "You don't even know why I got upset, do you?" Logan was unsure if he was expected to lie in response to that. "Well," Logan said cautiously, "no." Virgil sighed, and Logan heard footsteps as Virgil moved closer to the bed. "Well, why shouldn't I be upset?" he asked, sounding perhaps slightly bitter. "Have you given me any reason not to be?" "No," Logan replied, closing his eyes so he couldn't even see the visage of Virgil standing over him. He heard a heavy sigh from above him, and then quite suddenly a warm weight descended on top of Logan. Logan found his eyes opening once again as he blinked dumbly at the ceiling through strands of dark hair in his face. "Virgil?" Logan asked. "Shut up," Virgil replied, nuzzling his face into Logan's neck. Logan did shut up. He placed his hand on the other man's back with the lightest of pressure, so Virgil didn't feel trapped, and then let himself relax under the warm weight. They stayed that way for quite a while, Virgil's breath puffing against his neck and Logan all but limp under him. Then Virgil's head moved just slightly to the left, and they were kissing. It was not the first time they'd kissed, though their physical relationship had never escalated beyond that. It was, however, the first time they'd kissed since Virgil had learned what Logan really was. It surprised Logan that little had changed. The press of his lips was still just as soft and careful as it had been the first time they'd kissed, in the old, smelly apartment they'd once shared. His movements were always cautious, like he felt he might break Logan if he was anything other than gentle. He was probably right. Logan hadn't thought Virgil would be willing to kiss him at all after everything, but if he had entertained the idea, he'd have expected there to be a new harshness to it. Hate sex was a thing, after all, according to media at least. He'd have expected the desire to punish Logan for his transgressions to in some way color any sexual contact they might have. But there was none of that in this kiss. Logan's hand slid from Virgil's back to grip softly at the fabric of his shirt near his shoulders. His other hand remained awkwardly limp on the bed next to them. Virgil drew back after a moment, his breath fanning over Logan's nose as he looked him in the eyes briefly. Logan's grip on Virgil's shirt tightened, and Virgil seemed to take that as a cue to continue. The second kiss was just as achingly gentle as the one that had come before, and Logan could not understand why. This was a gift of affection that Logan did not understand, and certainly didn't deserve. Logan's unoccupied hands hesitantly started to move, resting on Virgil's hip at first, and then slowly sliding around toward the front. Virgil pulled back instantly. "I'm not asking for sex," he said, batting the hand away. "It's not what this is." It never had been. Logan had sometimes wondered if he'd someday want it to be, but most of the time he'd been relieved about that fact. Now he still felt relieved, but it was also frustrating, as he gave him no answers. "Then what is it, Virgil?" he asked. Virgil sighed. "We don't need to talk about it." "I've kidnapped you," Logan reminded. "Handcuffed you to heavy objects and gotten you fired from jobs. Technically, at this very moment, you are my prisoner. So what is this?" Virgil groaned, pressing his forehead to Logan's. "That's talking about it," he grumbled. Maybe they should talk about it, Logan thought. His mind couldn't help but return to the conversation he'd had with Remus hours ago. Yet this was the one area of his life Logan had always been cowardly in. He said nothing. Upon realizing Logan had willingly given in to his demands to shut up, Virgil kissed him again briefly, before tucking his face into Logan's neck and moving to card his fingers lazily through his hair. It was only a matter of moments before Logan felt his eyes flutter shut, the soothing feeling of having someone there and kind quickly lulling him to sleep.